given that Ennahda, an Islamist party, was the major leader in the drafting of Tunisia's constitution, how is it that the constitution ended up having no mention of Sharia law?
Ennahda went through an internal democratic process to figure out exactly what language they wanted in the constitution related to Islamic Sharia and other references to Islamic law. And they decided in their Shura Council by an internally democratic vote that they didn't want to push for the word Sharia or any reference to Sharia in the lawmaking process at all. And they did so, I think, because they are still trying to sort of figure out their own identity as both a political party and a social movement, which they are simultaneously. And they feel that the Islamization of society that they seek to achieve can only be done through social means, and that can't be done through a top-down political process. So I think that they felt internally that Tunisia wasn't quote-unquote ready for a reference to Sharia in the constitution, but I think that generally increasing Tunisians' identity with Islam is going to be part of their social aims in the coming years.
Thank you. Professor Brown, if you can boil it down to one factor, what do you think is the most important factor that accounts for the failure of Egypt's constitutional transition?
There are a lot of things that didn't go right in Egypt when writing the Constitution, but I would say the main problem was that you had a state of strong institutions that in some ways were a blessing. I mean, they kept the Egyptian state together at a time when, for instance, in Yemen or in Syria or in Libya, you've seen state collapse. But in Egypt, these were state institutions that retained their power, that were fundamentally unreformed, and that each one of them really resisted the constitutional process or resisted any democratic constitutional process, seeing that its role, whether it was the military or the security apparatus or the judiciary or the religious establishment, each of these institutions saw itself as representing and speaking for and protecting Egyptian society, and they were not going to go along with the process by which they were somehow being held accountable to a constitutional process or to democratic mechanisms.
Thank you. What is your outlook for Tunisia and Egypt in the coming months with regard to their respective transitions and constitutional development?
Well, Tunisia just came off of parliamentary elections in the fall of 2014 and presidential elections in 2015. The party that won a plurality of seats in parliament and also the presidency is called Nidat Tunis, and the president of the party and also the current president of the country is a man named Beji Caid Essebsi, who is was a senior figure in the former regime, and in many ways his party is a sort of regeneration of the old of the party of the old regime. And so I think the big question facing the constitutional transition is whether that party will adhere to the precedents that were set in or the vision that was set in the constitution-making process for the balance of power, that these kinds of political leaders don't have a lot of experience with, given their positions in the former regime. I think that there's some hope that this will be the case. Ennahda, which didn't do as well in the parliamentary elections as they did in 2011, did in fact join the government. And I think that there's general consensus that political parties need to work together to face Tunisia's real pressing economic and security challenges, especially given the tragic events of last week in front of the Bardo.
In Egypt, I just noticed a very strong contrast with Tunisia. When Duncan's talking, he talks about political parties or social movements, that sort of thing. In Egypt, I think that kind of lively politics of the period after the 2011 uprising, when you had Muslim Brotherhood and all these revolutionary movements playing an active role, is pretty much over. And the real question for the constitutional structures right now is really not so much how political actors in the society are going to operate, but really how state institutions are going to get along with each other. And the real fundamental question is whether the strong presidency that is being reconstructed by General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, former head of the armed forces, can really reestablish control, or whether instead what you'll have is a whole host of state institutions that are in some sense rivals as much as they are cooperating. So politics as we knew it in the 2011 to 2013 period, I think, is pretty much over, and instead you have a reassertion of the Egyptian state, and the only question is how coherent it will be.